Welcome to the BrightWord Books Podcast. BrightWord is a leading platform for diverse storytelling, where voices from all backgrounds can share their unique narratives and connect with readers from around the world. Follow our regular podcast updates, where we strive to foster a literary community that celebrates creativity, inclusivity, and the transformative power of literature. Good afternoon, and welcome back to the BrightWord Books Podcast. I'm John Lobb, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Annabelle Sandlin, who with Ellis Sandlin co-authored The Ember Eyed Tiger, Book 1. Annabelle, welcome to the podcast. We're so glad that you're able to join us today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, it's our pleasure. I haven't spoken to many children's book authors. It seems like a very special genre. It's an opportunity really to reach a very, very young audience with some important lessons.
It is. I think that this book does give some wonderful lessons. Our 2-year-old great-granddaughter was talking to my husband when he was alive, and she is very brilliant. She learned to read before she was 2, and she speaks in English and Spanish. And so my husband said, read page 19, I think it was 19, and so she read it to him. And she said, Grandpa, I think that the Spanish sounds better. At that time, we had Spanish, English, and Hindi. And so anyway, she read to him in the Spanish. And she said, doesn't that sound better than the English? And Ella, that does. So she,
Well, that's
every time
terrific.
she talks to me about the book. She said, I read that book to my parents every night.
Excellent. So what inspired the story of the Bengal tiger named Rovi?
Well, Ellis always loved tigers from the time he was a little kid. And he would watch them when he was able. He was blind after 16, but before that, his parents said, watch everything, look at the colors, look at the shapes, look at everything, so that if you do lose your sight, that you'll be able then to vision what's happening. So when he was retired, before he was retired, he said, I thought about that tiger often when I was be alone and all. But he said, as soon as I retired, he said, I took it from being a baby. And then I all of a sudden grew him up. And when he was 2 years old, he left his mother. And so he said, I thought, that is so neat. Well, he was talking about it. And I said to him, why don't you write it into a book? And he said, a book? He couldn't, because I write. And he said, I don't think I could write. When I said, then dictate and I will type it. And so I did. And he all kinds of ideas came out. He said, well, I remember when he did this, just like it sounded just like he had Rovi as his own pet, when he was growing up, because he just was so excited about Rovi, and he would tell me different stories. And even after book number 1 was done, and before he died, we talked enough. Probably we've written already 2 and 3, but with this book, then when we went ahead and we sent it in, and it just, I think the people that I have gotten letters from, or we've gotten calls from, Ellis got several calls at first, and it was like he loved that tiger. He thought of that tiger as a wonderful animal. He watched that on the different animal shows, and it was always the tiger that he thought, that tiger has the power. Now, when I was talking to his sister, Pat, she's one that edited the book after it was done. She said, I think of that Robbie almost as Ellis, that it was his thoughts going through, because she said when he'd feel really good, Ravi did good things. Happiness happened to Ravi. And she said that when like after Christmas, he said he was so glad to be with his family on Christmas. And so that was why, I believe, why he thought, I've got to make something happen, because in his mind, this poor Ravi had been shot. And it was like, how can I bring this about? Because he was so angry that Ravi wanted to go back and punish the man that shot him. And it was an orphanage that he came to in the woods, in the forest of India. And so when they saw Ravi come out of the jungle and looking, he was amazed. He had never seen a human being. He'd never smelled food being cooked. And he was looking around and he thought, wow, this is great. But when he went, whoa, whoa, well, they got it a little different way. And so they shot him. And so he limps back to his cave and he's lying there and he's hurting worse and worse. It really wasn't that bad. It was not that bad of a wound. But to him, it was painful and he had never had the experience. And the one thing that he kept thinking was, why? Why would someone shoot me? And Ellis said, and I don't know if you can understand this. And he said, but being blind, he said, people would say things to me and try to make me feel inadequate. And he always, on every one of his jobs, he did very, very well. And he got all kinds of awards for being so good at his jobs. But he said some people maybe they resented it, maybe they didn't understand blind people. But he said, I know what Robbie went through. And so he would explain to me the pain that went through Robbie as he's lying there and he's thinking these mean people. And he said, I can relate to that. And so he said,
Interesting.
then when I was looking up, he said, when Robbie was going in there and he was so angry, he said, all of a sudden I thought, it's Christmas and I shouldn't really be so angry. He said, let me look at Ellis. And so he said, that's when when Ravi looked up in the sky and saw Santa Claus. And he said, it was exciting because he said, I thought, I remember different times when had lost my eyesight and we would be at a family gathering. And then people would say, oh, well, I'm sorry, Ellis, you can't understand this. And he said, I thought, of course I can understand it. Describe it. I know like 2 years ago, we were driving down to Kentucky and all the way down there, I was telling Ellis, you're going to have to help me. And I told AAA, I said, I don't want to go through the highway. I want to go to the byway so that I can talk to Ellis and he can be part of the trip. Well, he did. I would tell him, I'd read what AAA said. And I'd say, you'll have to remember those names because while I'm driving, I don't have time. Well, he'd guide us all the way down to Kentucky. But he was saying, even then, he was telling me, he said, Anne, he said, remember in Robbie's book when this happened or that happened? And it was kind of like he was living it. And so when he would do something about the book, it was like, wait a minute, Anne, wait a minute. I think Robbie would have said this. I think Robbie would have done that. And as I said, it was like he put himself in there and he just loved it. He had 5 nephews and he loved doing things with the nephews. And he said when he was writing Robbie, he said, I was thinking of the time that I got to take this nephew here and I got to take that nephew and how the one was so pleased because he got to play on some kind of a game or something. And I would give him the money that he could do something. And he said, it just thrilled me. He said, I'm the one that got the warm fuzzies it wasn't my nephews, but he said, I think that's what Robbie was going through when he saw this little child, Manbir. And he said, I believe, and then he would tell me that, and then he would relate something that happened in his own life. And he said, I think maybe I can probably understand Ravi more than most people would be able to understand. And he said, this is what I would like to get to the children so that this is how a tiger could feel. And he said, I imagine there's a lot of kids that will have that book read to them, or they'll read it when they get old enough that they'll say, oh, I felt like that before. He said, I think they'll be able to relate to that.
Absolutely.
So, and
I know there's a transformation really from feelings of anger and revenge to feelings of friendship and love. And it sounds like that transformation in the story reflects perhaps the journey that Ellis undertook himself in life.
I think it was because, as I said, he used to be a fantastic singer. In fact, actually, until about a week before he died, he put on a wonderful 1-hour concert here at this senior place. But I think that when he was so angry, Ellis was telling me a couple of times when he was so angry, he said, I know how he felt because he said when one woman insisted on helping me. And he said, well, thank you, but I can do it myself. And she said, you're blind. I'm helping you whether you want it or not. He said, I was so angry. He said, if
Bet.
my
I'll
eyes could
bet.
have turned ember colored, they would have turned ember because he said, I didn't want to. He said, my parents had taught me to be independent. And he said, that's what Ravi's mother had taught him. She taught him how to hunt. She taught him how to chase animals. She taught him how to enjoy the water and everything in their territory, and had taught him that there was a territory and that he was in control of that territory, that Ravi was in control of that territory. So he said, I can understand, because he said a couple of times, he said one woman, he said, I think I might have hurt her, because he said, I just pushed my arms and said, get away from me. And she said, oh my, for a blind person, you're so touchy. And he said, that was not a good thing for somebody to say to a blind person, you know?
Absolutely. Good for
Yes.
Ellis.
Well,
So
his parents,
the ember eyes that the tiger is described as having, they're truly symbolic as well.
yes, because the more he thought about it, the angrier he got, the more brighter they got. So that when he was walking back, the jungle was lit on the pathway, and that was how his story, Santa Claus could see that there were all of a sudden there was this pathway going there, and Santa Claus couldn't see because it was so dark and no very cloudy and no stars, no anything in the sky, no moon. And so he said, I remember then, after I was so angry, that someone came up and said, Ellis, you do wonderful, wonderful. Here you are walking a whole block to go and get your groceries, and then you bring them back home and you do them, you cook yourself. And he said, I felt like $1,000,000 because I thought, okay, somebody recognizes my skills. Yet Ellis was looking all of his life for the perfect wife, somebody that recognized his talent and his personality and his being the real who was the real Ellis. And he moved in here a couple of years before I did. And then two of my friends had me move in. They said, oh, you've got to come over. I sold my big house. And I went from a 5-bedroom, 3-bath home to a 1-bedroom, probably not. I don't think this whole apartment is as big as my living room was over there. And so when I talked to Ellis, had just a very small apartment, but that's all he needed. But he was a wonderful cook. And so my friends said to him, would you come down? We're having a birthday party for Annabelle. And he said, yes, he would. So anyway, he came down and he brought his guitar and came in. But what he did is he opened up the door and I opened up the door and told him how to get there. He turned around because I told him, don't, please be very careful right here because I have a very expensive piece of furniture that has some very valuable things in it. He almost hit the book. I mean, they almost hit the glass, and that glass would have killed him if it had hit. And so I very gently moved it around. And Alice said, I can carry my own guitar case. And I said, I know you can, but this is my home. And I said, if I had not done that, you probably would have broken some glass and you probably would have killed yourself. So I said, I did it for that reason. But I said, if I have offended you, you may leave. You don't have to stay. I hope you choose to stay, but if you choose not to, I won't be offended. He said, I'll stay. And I don't remember what was said, but anyway, he said, I just thought, oh, this is a woman I have been waiting for. Well, then two of the other women said to him, has anybody ever had a birthday party for you here? And he said, no. And they said, would you like it? And he said, yes, because his birthday was in 3 months. And so when it came time for that, I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not sure I even heard him talking about this birthday party. But they came up to me a week before his birthday, and said, Anne, what are you going to do for Ellis's birthday? And I said, what am I going to do? And she said, yes. Well, anyway, I had made him spaghetti and a big salad, and we came to the party, and he asked a million questions. And I don't remember myself even answering them. But anyway, he never told me that he had any feelings because I never really hardly talked to him, but he would knock at my door once in a while and he'd have 2 cans up. He'd say, "Could you tell me which is a can of corn and which is a can of green beans?" And so I would tell him because he said, "I got 'em mixed up," and we'd laugh for a few minutes. And, he said to me one time, Can I just come in?" I said, "No, I don't let any men in my apartment unless my friends are over here." And so, anyway, then he'd go back home, and that was only happening once a month or so. Then he went into the hospital, and he had COVID, and he was in there for, I believe, 3 weeks in oxygen. He was very ill, nearly died, and then he came home, and he was only home for about, I think it was somebody said about a week, and he caught something else, probably from lying there so long, and had to go back into the hospital. Well, it was wonderful when you go past his apartment because you would hear this wonderful singing. He was such a great singer. And so anyway, the friends came over and she said, have you heard Ellis? Because he came back from the hospital and I don't know, then he came back and then he went back and I thought he came back. But here it is the day after Thanksgiving and everybody's gone from downstairs and I can't ask anybody to let me in. And they said, "Anne, would you please call the police?" I don't know why it always wound up that Annabelle wound up getting to the pleasure, but
Annabelle
anyway,
takes care of people, right?
I said, "Fine, I'll call the police." So I called them and told them that I had not heard anything and we were concerned. So they said, "We'll be right over." And so anyway, just about that time, another woman came up to me and said, "Oh no, he went over to his nephew's house and he had Thanksgiving with them and he's going to stay until Sunday." And I said, "Oh." And so I said, I called the police and they said, "Well, they're already over there." And so when I went back over to his apartment, they said, "Oh, I'm so glad you did that because some of the people here have died, and been in their room for like a week or so." So anyway, and I didn't think anything more about it. Well, of course, my friend that lives across from me and that lives kind of cornered across from him, so his friend for 4 years before I ever met him. And so she apparently told, about Annabelle. Didn't say that she was the one that asked me to call, but Annabelle was quite concerned about you. And frankly, I really didn't even know Ellis at that time. But anyway, then Ellis came down. Well, what? Yeah, he came down about the middle part of January because he had been recovering. And I wasn't able to attend. I had never attended his wonderful music before that. It just seemed like there was always something that was doing, or I was taking somebody out or was going somewhere. So anyway, then he came down at that time and knocked on my door and told me how much he thought of me. And I said, "Well, that was wonderful." I said, "I think a lot of you too, Alice." I said, "Thank you." And I started to close the door and he said, "Well, just a moment then." And about, "Can I come in?" I said, "No, but I'll come out in the hallway." So I went out and he said, "I want you to know, I really think an awful lot of you." Because he said, "I feel good about myself when I'm around you." And he
How
said,
sweet.
every time every time after, I talk to you, when you just tell me what a can of corn is, he said, "I just have a good feeling." And so he said, "I just want you to know how I feel about you." And I said, "Well, thank you. That's very nice." Still not thinking there's a big difference between somebody respecting, which is what I thought he was saying, "I respect you." Well, anyway, he started telling his family then about me, and, then he came over again, and then he told me how he felt, and he told me that he said, "I really want to marry you." And I said, "What?" And he said, "I want to marry you." And I told him, I said, "Ellis, you don't even know me." And then he started telling me, describing how Robbie felt at different times. And he was saying, when I sometimes sit there and even after I'm playing and I feel lonely, he said, "I think that remember you're at my birthday party, you said this or you said that." Just a calm, like you would turn around and say to one of your children or one of your
Mhm.
friends something. And he said, "It meant so much to me." And so anyway, I told him, I said, "Well, we'll have to get acquainted." I told him at first, I said I wasn't interested in getting married again because my husband had died and that 3 years before that. And I said, I'm not thinking at my age of ever remarrying. And He said, Annabelle, I'm going to be praying about this, that God will let you fall in love with me. And I said, well, then I'll be praying that God won't let me. I said, no. I said, it's not you, Ellis, because I said, you're such a nice man and everybody here loves you so much. But I said, I just don't want to fall in love again because I said, I have buried 3 husbands and I mean, now, 2 of them have cancer. So anyway, he said, well, I'm going ahead and pray. Well, the next morning, I do believe it was the Holy Spirit that said to me, I didn't hear something, scared me. I'm lying in bed and I'm hearing this male voice saying, I didn't hear something. And I said, what? And he said, I didn't hear you say, not my will, but yours be done. Well, I broke down and cried and just then the phone rang and Ellis said, Annabelle, God just told me that he just talked to you. Did he? And I said, yes, he did. And he said, how do you feel about me? It was so wonderful because it was like God filled me with the greatest love that you can, I can't even describe it. And so when Alice wanted to know if he could come down, and I said, no, I'm writing. But I said, if you want to call me this evening after 6, that's okay. So every evening we talk from 6 until 1. And after a week, he told me so many things, and he told me about Ravi, the book, a story about Ravi, and he was talking about how how he understood how Ravi felt. And he said, Anne, when I felt that God was telling me that he was already talking to you, he said, I just felt, and then he would tell about how he felt. And he said, like, so Ravi was so proud to be walking around with the children with the Sanders on his back. He said, because he was so pleased that he had this wonderful relationship with this little orphan boy. And he said, it was like, he said, I can't even tell you. And I said, I think I know. I think I know what you're saying. But anyway, then after that, I would say, what else have you thought about this, about your tiger? And he told me many stories, which many of them will be in book 2 and 3 and 4 or whatever, I'll write. But anyway, then we talked about the little boy. And he said, let me tell you about some of my nephews. So he started telling me about his relationship with his nephews and how he said, I think that's how Robbie felt about Manbir, just like I felt about my wonderful nephews. And I said, well, that's great. That's great. And then he said, I thought too, he said, here he had hurt me. He had been hurt, but Santa Claus talked to them and let them know that he had hurt, that he had been shot. And so they were sorry. And he said, I remember when I was working and a couple of women that just highly offended me until finally one time he said, I had to say to my boss, I don't think I can work here any longer because these women are always offending me. And so the boss called the 2 ladies in and he said, then he called me in at the same time. And the 2 women said, Ellis, we didn't mean to offend you. We thought that you always are telling funny jokes. And we thought that you would be pleased that we were teasing you and including you. And he said, it was the first time in my life I thought, I wonder how many people were teasing me because they heard me joking and they thought I wanted to be. And so anyway, he said, it made me feel entirely different. So it was a wonderful opportunity during that time before we got married for, he would call, as I said, he'd call me and talk until 1 or 2 in the morning. And he would say, I want to tell you about this thing that happened when I was working. I want to tell you about one time when a car hit me and how people helped me. And then he told me, he said, I never thought before of any of these as good things. But he said, I'm realizing now how much good. And he was a wonderful Christian. He is the only person I ever knew that he went with Bible study with me, with just women and him. And we would talk about different scriptures. And he would say, well, what that reminds me of, and then he would tell the entire chapter, not just the 2 verses. And then he would go back and he would say, this is how these 2 verses relate to me and to you. And I said, well, you should have been a minister because he understood. And so many women say, I have read that time after time, and I never really understood it before. but he explained to us. And every morning when we did Bible study, I would say to him, Ellis, what can you tell me about this? Well, then I heard about other chapters and maybe 4 or 5 that related to that, and then only 1 or 2 verses. But he was so understanding. And he said, I never understood these verses myself, Anne, until I married you. But he said, they all come alive. And he said, I think that's what Ravi was experiencing. He had been alone in his cave, a beautiful cave. He had eaten all these wonderful animals. He had this water he splashed in because tigers are the only animal a cat that will take a bath. They're the only ones that will get in water and clean off. And he said, let me tell you how I think about this. Let me tell you how I think about that. Well, maybe our 1 hour Bible study in the morning, just the 2 of us did, might be 2 hours. And then some evenings we would invite just one person over and we'd say, would you like to do it? We're going to be studying 3 verses, maybe say in the Bible. And all the women that came over said when he died, they said, oh my gosh, the evenings that you invited me over were probably the most exciting evenings that I had because I learned so much about the Lord. And
Wow.
he was really invite him over so that he would sing. We'd do the 3 verses, and then he would sing to us about 4 or 5 wonderful songs. Mm, and everybody loved it, and everybody said, "Oh, I had my own personal, concert, over, with you last night, and that was wonderful." But everything when we would talk, so much of everything went back to Ravi because it
Interesting.
was like,
And it sounds like you had a wonderful life partnership,
"We
and
did
that's reflected as a wonderful writing partnership and producing the book.
it does, it did." It did, and because it would make him think, and by the time we got the book sent in, I had learned 10 things, that's why they said, "Well, you should really put your name on it too," and I said, "No, no, it was Ellis's book," but they said, "But it was your book too, because it was talking
You
with you that
created it together.
created it together."
Wonderful.
Yes, and I when I think of the different angry and all that, but it became very important to him that everybody here, everybody that he met knew about the Lord. It was like in the book, he was sitting down with Ravi with Sandber, because the chaplain or the minister was going to come out of the chapel and tell them the story of the first Christmas. And so he said, I remembered he and I had talked about this. He said, I remembered how I felt the time when I really understood that first Christmas. And then he said, John 3:16, everybody stops at John 3:16. But he said, that's not good because he said, because 17 and 18 say, but if you don't accept the Lord, you're condemned already. And he said, and people have to know that, because he said, I've had so many people say, well, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son, that, and he said, so he said, they think that he saved everybody. They didn't have anything, but it's like, I want them to know they have to accept the Lord. And he said, that's why in the book, I talked about it, why, it became something, and why in each one of his books, he wanted those two, the first Christmas and John 3:16, 17, and 18 in there. And, he said, I want children to hear that. I want them to think about it. I want them to hear that, but if you don't, you're condemned already if you don't accept him. So it's not like you just, like the kids think, okay, I went to Sunday school and I accept Jesus. Yeah, I accept him. And he said, I want them to know they have a responsibility of thinking, am I really sorry for what I am doing? And do I really wish I hadn't have said that? And to recognize,
And to reach children, to get that message across, I think using an animal is so effective. I
yes,
remember reading a book called Mouse House when I was a child. I still remember all these years later how much I enjoyed that book and the lessons that it contained. So I think animals are something that children can relate to. So
yes.
I think it's an excellent vehicle for delivering the messages that you sought to deliver.
I think it was too, and that's what I told him. I said, "Oh, Ellis, I'm so glad that you had picked out an animal and that you made him, his mother taught him right, and he knew how to be the greatest hunter, but he also knew how to share with his sisters. And so it shows that, children that hear just because you've got all this great big gob of meat. And if your sisters don't have it, you want to share that. And there were so many things in there that we talked about. And I said, Ellis, you're putting it through. And I know that I started typing it, and then it took me 2 weeks because he would think of something else. Going
Full of
back to
ideas. Full of ideas.
Yes, yes, he was, and then even after the book was done, he would say, "Oh, Anne, in the next book, we've gotta tell about this. Oh, we've gotta do this, Anne, in the next book." So I wrote down kind of a big book here full of his ideas so that they will be, in the future books because
Excellent, excellent. So there'll be more to come. I know that our viewers will be pleased to hear that the story of the tiger doesn't end with the first book.
no, right now we have 2 and 3 that are, I think, out there are going to be out there very soon, and then I think the next one probably won't be until Christmas of next year. But maybe not. It'll be sooner. But I believe the animals. And like when he would describe to me and to the people that came over here to visit,
What a talented individual.
he was. He used to, when he was in Texas and when he was in Tennessee, he registered. And then when there'd be somebody in town, he got to play with a couple pretty famous people. And he said, one of the men was apologizing. He said, "We only give you $100, even though you stayed for the whole 3 hours." He said, "I would have given you 500 to have played with them if you had them given me the 100," because he
Oh, that's
really,
terrific. Well,
he
Annabelle,
also,
our time is running down for today,
I'm
but I
sorry.
just wanted to say thank you so much for visiting with us and sharing the story. It's certainly a special book indeed. It's just so enlightening to hear the backstory and the life partnership that went into becoming writing partners and producing such a meaningful book for children.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
We've been speaking with Annabelle Sandlin, co-author with her late husband Ellis of The Ember Eyed Tiger. And I believe it's now available on Amazon and anywhere fine books are available. Annabelle, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the BrightWord Books Podcast, home of the literary community that celebrates creativity, inclusivity, and the transformative power of literature. Don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss future episodes. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.